What is your field?
International relations, and I have also expertise in political theory and history.
Now, how do you see the field, those fields, international relations and political theory, evolved in the 90s?
The end of the Cold War, I think, opened up a sense that there was a very wide spectrum of political processes operating at the global level that we didn't have much of a good handle on. And so the field has now moved away from its kind of central core around interstate relations in which economic and political issues dominate, to include a much broader spectrum of issues, everything from climate change to human rights, non-state actors, transnational processes. And so IR has become much more diverse, but at the same time, political theorists have discovered the global realm. So if you look particularly at people who work on democracy now, the big debates and the action is in the area of theories of global democracy. And so both fields have changed, although not necessarily in dialogue with each other.
Oh, so do you mean that there is less interdisciplinarity, or those goals have not necessarily been attained, interdisciplinary work, or how would you characterize that?
I think this is a complex question, because I think on the one hand the field is more interdisciplinary than it was, in the sense that international relations now and for the last 20 years has been drawing on intellectual influences coming out of other disciplines. Mm-hmm. So coming out of law, coming out of sociology, even coming out of anthropology. And so in that sense, the field is more intellectually open and interdisciplinary in that sense. I think but at the same time, I think the field is also, certain elements of the field have hardened, okay, and congealed around certain commitments. So I think particularly if you look at the North American Academy, what you'll see is the dominance of rational choice approaches and on a sort of privileging of hard methodology, particularly quantitative methodologies. And so on the one hand, I think the field has become at some levels intellectually more open. On the other hand, it's become more congealed around certain commitments. And I think those two things are happening in tandem.
So you're saying, and that's the positive aspect, that international relations have integrated some input from other disciplines and other fields, but do you think that international relations have something to say outside their own field, to other disciplines?
Right. I do think they do. I mean, one of the things that, and one way of thinking about this would be to think about the debates about global democracy. I mean, much of the literature by political theorists on global democracy seems to have a kind of naivety about the way in which the political structures of the state system operate to constrain and shape the kind of institutional practices you can develop at the international level. Now, IR scholars have a well-honed repertoire of kind of skeptical literature about this, which I think can in fact be of great assistance to those that are wanting to think about the potential to develop, for example, global democratic institutions. But, having said that, I think that IR is also struggling to escape its own narrow confines as a field that was very narrowly concerned with interstate relations with a fairly limited repertoire of theories. And so at the same time that we have something to offer, I think we also have a lot to learn.
In the past, there have been some attempts to theorize international institutions from the perspective of international relations, and also to maybe help them build better structures, projects on human governance, etc., etc. Do you see any innovations now, to the extent that IR scholars would have some interesting ideas that international institutions could use? Do you see any impact?
It's very hard to judge impact. However, I do think that there is work out there that is important and valuable for questions of institutional design and development. But it's not always in the areas that you most readily think of it. I think, for example, that one area that I'm particularly interested in is scholarship that is bringing together empirical and normative inquiry. Because I think that ultimately, at the international level or at the domestic level, those that are interested in creating institutions are interested in questions of political action. And those questions are questions that can't be answered unless we deal with the conditions of political action, which are essentially empirical questions, and with the purposes of political action, which are essentially normative questions. So we need to be bringing those into dialogue. And the pockets, interestingly, the pockets of IR scholarship that are doing that are not central to the field. I think of Robert Cohen's work with Buchanan on how to think about preventive diplomacy, preventive intervention. These are really good examples of how you do interdisciplinary work that in IR that can really address some of these fundamental questions of institutional design. Much of the work done by the English School, I think, the work of Nick Wheeler and others, again, looking at questions of how do you deal with issues of humanitarianism in the context of a system of sovereign states? How do you talk about issues of intervention? When is intervention legitimate? These are all, I think, important strands of work being done in the field. But also, I think that there are other strands of the field that new areas where people are just starting to work that are not easily identified with what traditionally has been IR, but are becoming more and more important.
How do you think the field will develop, and also how do you think the field should develop?
Okay, this is very hard to speak in any sort of singular way about how the field will develop, because the field is now so diverse, and in some ways the field is now divided into a series of different tribes, and they may not have a sort of unilinear or a singular path of development. I think that to the extent that the American Academy still dominates international relations, I think there is the tendency in the American Academy at the moment is toward, I think, a narrowing of scope around a privileging of rational choice perspectives and quantitative methods, and certainly positivist methods, the positivist versions of qualitative methods. And I think that centre is not uncontested, but it is the centre of gravity of the field. And I don't see anything at the moment changing that. You do have interesting intellectual trends around that. The sort of Katzenstein project on analytical eclecticism, which is an attempt to move away from deep debates about meta theory to looking at much more problem-driven research. And I suspect that it may be that they're the two kind of poles of scholarship in the United States for some time. However, that's not going to be scholarship in the rest of the world. I think you're going to find that the English scholarship is going to remain quite different. I think there are going to be strong strands of critical scholarship, feminist scholarship, critical theory that are going to continue in other places. And what's going to happen is we're going to get parts of the field that don't talk to each other. I think that's what's happening now, and it's unfortunate, but and we should do what bridge building we can. But I think looks like being the kind of medium-term trend. I think this is not. I mean, I'm personally somebody who's not a great trench warrior. Right? I like people talking to each other, and I'm always much more enriched by talking to people who don't see the world in the same way that I do. And so I tend to think that a healthy field is a field where you've got a sort of pluralistic dialogue that's going on. And I think we should do what we can to encourage that. My own preference is for the field to try and re-embrace some of its early practical commitments. And the field, when international relations has emerged as a self-conscious discipline, at the beginning of the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century, it has a very strong series of commitments to addressing fundamental problems of the human predicament, particularly the causes of war and the conditions of peace. And I think the field has in many respects lost that practical mission, which doesn't mean that everybody needs to be doing practical work, but a commitment to big questions. And we're living in an era where there are many big questions that IR should be speaking to. But sadly, I think that much of the scholarship in the field is not speaking to big questions. I think much of the scholarship in the field has become technique-driven rather than question-driven. And we need to bring it back to what really matters, and that is addressing big and important questions in global politics. And then treating method as a secondary issue. Important, but secondary issue. A servant of questions.
How do you think that academia should develop? What's a good project for academia for the future?
Well, I think academia in many places is now under pressure to become much more accountable to government, and much more accountable for the government funds that it deploys. And in many places, you can see this occurring in Britain now, it's been long occurring in Australia, is that there is a tendency of government to say academics are spending public dollars and they should be accountable for that, and they should be able to show the impact of their work, and impact means influence on things like public policy. And so I think that there is a tendency to make academia much more instrumentally directed. I think I have some sympathy for the idea that in international relations in particular, we should be able to say something to questions that matter to society. I think though there is a risk of technocratizing the academy and making and removing and undermining the ability to pursue, first of all, free inquiry, but also losing sight of the fact that universities have historically been an important site of critique in society. And there is some danger that element of the purpose and role of universities will be lost. And it's a crucially important role. So it's a role that becomes even more important when you consider that media ownership is becoming more and more concentrated in the hands of a number of big monopolies, and therefore the space for original debate and critical engagement with issues is shrinking. And so it's very important that universities defend themselves as a site in this regard. And so my own sense in this regard is that the academy needs to think about its public role as being a role in which it is part of social discourses that occur in wider public spheres, rather than narrowly focused on serving government. So there is a kind of recovery of an earlier mission of the academy that I think is important. And when dealing with practical issue, what would be the role of the humanities? You were speaking about a possible technocratization of university, but then what would the humanities do? Right. Well, I mean, by the humanities, I assume that you're thinking of literature, history, philosophy. These are not areas that have been separate from public debate. I mean, if you think about the role, for example, that philosophers have played. I mean, let's take an example. Who would be the most influential scholars that have spoken on questions of war and peace in the United States? Well, we can note a number of sort of prominent realists in the post-1945 period, people like Morgenthau who opposed the Vietnam War, but I suspect you'd find it hard to find somebody who had a greater influence on these debates than Michael Walzer, political philosopher. And philosophers have historically had very significant influence on public debate. But again, it's the role that they can perform is a role of subjecting social issues to critical scrutiny and to reflecting on those. And I think the same can be said for historians. In many societies, historians have been centrally involved in debates about how national polities understand their own histories and how those histories are involved in the construction of particular kinds of identities. So there's enormous room for humanities scholars to be involved in these kinds of discussions. But again, these are discussions of the role of intellectuals in the public sphere. They're not, can we write a report on X issue for government?